The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. We are now ready to begin today's webinar, Creating an Ownership Culture to Enhance Returns on Equity Share Programs. My name is Bethany Dennis with the Rutgers NJ, New York Center for Employee Ownership. I will be your host and moderator. Today's webinar will cover how organizations can design effective share plan strategies and create an ownership culture to increase the returns on their equity program investments. The webinar is scheduled for 30 minutes with Q&A at the end. Participants are muted, so please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar questions box at any time. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the presentation will be sent to you via email. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Bill Castellano, Chair of the Rutgers Human Resource Management Department, as well as Executive Director for the New Jersey, New York Center for Employee Ownership, has over 40 years of experience working in corporate Fortune 50, entrepreneurial, and research environments. His research, teaching, and consulting activities are focused on the effective management of human capital, employee engagement, and employee ownership and equity compensation. Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually, talking about creating an ownership culture to enhance the returns on share programs. I think before we talk specifically about creating a culture, it's, I think, important to look at the context in which organizations are thinking about implementing various types of equity share plans. And looking at the context, we are truly living in interesting times. Many pundits call this the new normal. Organizations are facing disruptive technology, increasing global competition. We're seeing an unprecedented slowing of the labor force. And in result of this is many major economic challenges. These are creating some headwinds that I think is important to consider when implementing a share plan. So as an example, we're seeing much slower growth, much greater reliance on intangible assets. When we think about GDP growth, regardless of perhaps your political philosophy, there are two basic functions of GDP growth. Either we have a growing workforce that's producing more goods and services, or we have higher productivity rate. We are now experiencing one of the lowest labor force growth rates in our history. It's significantly less than 0.5%. And if you look at the long-term trend of productivity growth, which has been around 1.8%, it's going to be a challenge for organizations to have sustainable growth over an extended period of time of over 3%. At the same time, we're seeing organizations' wealth being created predominantly by their intangible assets. When we think about intangible assets, these are predominantly organizations' human and intellectual capital. So how organizations are now managing their human capital, it has the greatest impact on their market value and their success, which I think is one of the biggest drivers of why equity compensation and employee ownership is becoming so prominent. Another factor that I think is important to consider is we're seeing a tremendous problem in this country and beyond with wealth and income inequality. One of the drivers of the inequality in this country has been what we call as decoupling of productivity and income growth. So for many decades, workers got the benefit of productivity growth, but around the 1980s, that decoupling resulted in the productivity growth going predominantly to share owners and equity owners. And as a result, income has been pretty stagnant for the vast majority of employees for quite some time. In fact, the bottom 3% of the labor force actually has seen a reduction in net income. Only the top maybe 10% has seen an increase. So this is creating some challenges for organizations and helping employees think about long-term strategies for creating wealth. And I think what this chart is showing is how important equity is in helping their employees save for their retirement. And the result of that productivity decoupling is right now, and this is only going to 2013, we're actually compiling these numbers for 2018. but they tell the same story. You know, the top 1% of households control over 50% of the wealth in stocks and mutual funds, and the bottom 90% have less than 10%. So I think this is a real reason why many organizations are thinking about implementing various types of share plan equity programs to help address these income and wealth inequality, considering how competitive it is to get top talent in a very tight labor market that's growing at a very slow rate. And there are many reasons why organizations should be thinking about equity compensation programs. We at the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing have been doing research in this area for decades. A recent study that we did with the National Bureau of Economic Research data, as well as the Best Place of Work data, this comprised millions of employees over an extended period of time, shows that equity compensation has some very positive impact on employee outcomes. The research we've done has shown that organizations that have these types of plans have higher committed employees, lower turnover rates, employees that are engaging in more discretionary effort, helping employees, volunteering, more co-monitoring of each other. So that helps organizations deal with what economists may call the free riding effect. These employees are also offering more suggestions. So organizations that have these positive employee outcomes are able to have positive strategic outcomes. And the research that I'm alluding to, we've seen much higher productivity growth and much higher innovation. And that in turn can lead to greater financial outcomes. And in the research that we did here, it did indeed lead to much higher return on firm equity. So when we think about what's going on, what types of equity compensation type programs, share strategies are having this type of an positive income outcome effect, I should say, we look at four major things. Organizations that have share plans that help employees accumulate wealth while managing their financial risk have the greatest employee outcomes. And the various kinds of strategies that we've noted that resulted in these positive relationships, first and foremost, no wage substitution, meaning if you're going to offer equity type programs, it should not be a substitute for wages. We also saw organizations that have both long-term equity type strategy programs coupled with short-term, could be a bonus plan, a profit sharing plan, had also very positive effects. Equally important is having a separate diversified retirement program. And not surprisingly, the greatest impact were firms that offered equity as a grant or at substantial discounts. And I think the reason for that is that significantly reduces the financial risk that employees may be incurring when participating in equity type programs. So taking a deeper dive, we did see that other organizations had even more positive employee strategic and financial outcomes. And these were organizations that not only were creating equity programs strategically based upon the research that we just discussed, but were also able to create what we call an employee ownership culture. And when we talk about an employee ownership culture, it's important to realize that a culture is basically derived from the various HR practices and programs that organizations implement in what we would call an HR system. And equity compensation plays a very big role in looking at that system and how it creates a culture. So it's important to think about, how do we manage the competencies by our recruiting and selection programs? How do we manage the work environment with job design and organizational structures? And how do we manage or motivate employees to behave in the ways that are conducive to meeting organization objectives through incentive and reward programs. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, equity compensation plays a very big role in creating this type of a system that in turn creates a culture. And organizations that do this well obviously have the employee contributions that are going to be the input for their sustainable competitive advantage. So I think this in turn, is what's happening in how these types of programs and systems achieve strategic and financial outcomes. So what are the specific practices that actually create what we call this ownership culture? So looking at various organizations and various HR practices, we identified 4, or actually 5, major practices that when you incorporate these practices with an effective equity compensation program, we saw significantly greater employee strategic and financial outcomes. So what are those practices? First and foremost, organizations that share information with their employees. So this could be information about their financial status, how the firm is doing, any strategic initiatives that the firm is thinking about implementing. Also important is sharing information about how an employee or their group is contributing to the success of the organization. Right? In research, we would call that having a line of sight. Other things that we saw, organizations that empower employees to be more accountable in how they conduct the work that they do for their organization. Organizations that have employee involvement type programs. So involvement could be a variety of different types of strategies. These could be problem-solving work groups, self-directed teams, companies that engage people in helping them make decisions. Equally important in creating this ownership culture. Not surprisingly, companies that also heavily invest in training and development. If you want employees to think and act like an owner, it makes sense to help them gain the kinds of skills and competencies that they're going to need not only to be individually successful, but also to help their organization be successful. And then lastly, organizations that embrace what we call a participatory management philosophy. Not surprisingly, managers play a very big role in creating an organizational culture. So having managers that share information, that allow employees to be more participatory, soliciting their advice when making strategic type decisions, it really does entail having managers that embrace that type of philosophy. It's a big driver of creating this ownership culture. So research is looking at all of these positive relationships with various kinds of HR practices and equity compensation programs, and thinking about, well, what's really driving these positive employee strategic and financial outcomes. And one body of research is, well, there is what we call a self-selection going on, right? Meaning employees typically self-select into firms that align with their values and interests. And what this research is showing, that organizations that embrace equity compensation, that have variable compensation type programs, attract a certain employee that seems to be more productive than employees that are not selected or self-selecting into those types of firms. So this could be a real driver of what's creating these positive outcomes. And if that's the case, which we believe is the case, it makes sense for companies to communicate their philosophy to both the outside world. We believe in equity compensation. We believe in creating this type of a culture to have employees self-select. But equally important is to communicate this internally, to let your employees know about the benefits of these types of programs. So that entails having a sophisticated communication strategy. We found in some of the research that we've conducted that in many firms, a large number of employees may not even know about the different types of equity share programs that may be available. So I think it's imperative that organizations use, a variety of delivery methods to ensure that their employees and the outside world know about this philosophy. So as this chart is showing, there's plenty of pros and cons for different types of methods. It's important to think about using all of these methods more strategically to ensure that both the inside and the outside world is familiar with what you're doing. Not surprisingly, organizations that have a robust employee ownership culture spend a lot of time in financial education or financial wellness of their employees. And there's a lot of interesting research about how financial education creates this engagement culture and results in how employees are in turn more engaged. And important outcomes of financial education is to think about, well, there are two important risks to communicate. What I find interesting is the first one, right? The biggest risk is for employees to not participate in equity type programs. If you go back to the previous slides when we talked about this wealth gap that's pretty much derived because people aren't saving enough for their long-term needs and their retirement needs, we know that equity plays a very big role in helping employees accumulate wealth. And we are having a retirement crisis in this country. The vast majority of employees are not saving enough for retirement. And we know that one of the most effective ways to accumulate wealth for retirement is to have money involved in equity over an extended period of time. We know the power of compounding over 10, 20, 30, 40 years could be pretty powerful. And educating employees about that is very, very important. The second component of financial education would be also highlighting, well, there are always going to be risks involved in equity. And the research that Harry Markowitz, a Nobel Prize economist, found that no individual, right, should have more than 15% of a diversified portfolio in any one stock. So that's important. If you have a very robust equity compensation type program, to be able to communicate to employees the importance of having a diversified portfolio and not overly investing in their one company stock is very, very important. So we've been doing quite a bit of research on this topic through the Rutgers Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. We also have the New York Center for Employee Ownership, and it's the largest research operation in the world. We have over 120 research fellows doing this research. We've actually helped shape federal and state policies. We conduct major research conferences annually. And through the center, we offer a variety of training programs and conferences and workshops for individuals that want more training or more information about employee ownership. So I advise you to go to ownership.rutgers.edu for more information. Part of our mission is to also promote participatory management, which, as we discussed, is really the key component of creating an ownership culture. So we've created a 5-day intensive certificate program that covers all of the characteristics of participatory management. We're going to be running this program here in New Brunswick, New Jersey in October. And for those who register before May 31st, we'll be offering a 15% discount. We also have people who can do research at your organization. So we can design, administer employee surveys. We can help you develop solutions. So clearly, if you have information or need more information about how we can help you maybe solve some of these challenges that you're facing, feel free to reach out to me directly. So at this point, hopefully some of you have been submitting some questions to
Hello everybody. We're now at the question and answer portion of the webinar. Please type in any questions that you might have. Bill, I do have the first question for you is, how do companies assess their employee ownership culture?
Well, that's a really good question. Many firms that I think embrace this research already are thinking about measuring employee engagement. Because after all, I think that's what we're talking about. You know, an employee ownership culture with a strategic share plan program, we know are big drivers of employee engagement. So I think understanding the kinds of questions that you need to be asking. So I think you need to ask questions about who's participating in these programs. You know, what types of programs are they participating? You know, especially for organizations that may be offering multiple equity type programs. They may have a grant program, they may have a profit sharing, they may have people who can also participate in employee stock purchasing plans. So you want to get a sense of who's participating, perhaps what % of their income is derived from equity. So you want to get a measure of the level of equity participation. And then equally important is to start thinking about, well, what are the other complementary practices that we feel we are implementing that create this ownership culture, right? So what are the perspectives that employees have on training, on empowerment, and all the things that we know create this culture. And then lastly, you know, you want to have measures of employee engagement, employee outcomes. You know, so to what extent are they involved in making decisions? To what extent are they going above and beyond? And then that in turn, you know, can lead to the strategic and financial outcomes that are typically important for organizations. So it's done through a survey. That's one of the services that we provide. Especially if a firm is doing an engagement survey, we can give advice about adding some questions. We can help out actually doing the analysis. Thank you. That was a good question.
Great. All right, we have another question. What is the role of leadership in creating an employee ownership culture?
Another good question. Clearly, leaders and leadership characteristics are a big driver of shaping any type of an organizational culture. So the research on that typically is that those leaders that engage in more transformational type leadership characteristics seem to have the greatest impact in creating this kind of a culture and also in promoting employee engagement. So I often get a question from leaders, well, what's the difference between the transformational leader and perhaps a situational leader? And my response typically is, well, a situational leader gets people to believe in them because of their power, their status, and the like. But a transformational leader gets people that believe in themselves, right? So it's a very different kind of an orientation. You know, these are leaders that create a very stimulating type work environment. They have very high emotional intelligence, but they have very high standards as well. They have a high bar. They want people to be successful, but they do care about their employees and help promote employee development as well. Another good question.
Great. Well, that was our last question. If any of you have any follow-up questions, our contact information is going to be on the final slide. Oh, hold on. I spoke too soon. We've got a new one. We'll do one more. How would a new technology company build around an ESOP strategy? What are the benefits / challenges?
Well, ESOP is probably one of the most extensive employee ownership type strategy, right? So firms that are looking to a succession plan to either raise more money or if there's an ownership status that's changing, you have an ability to sell your firm to your employees, right? You can typically do that through an ESOP. The benefit is the owners are getting compensated, but at the same time, the firm is going to be intact. It benefits the employees because there's a high probability that the organization is going to continue the way it's been continuing. There are tremendous tax benefits to both the owners who are selling to their employees, as well as employees that are participating in these ESOP type programs. So it's a very interesting strategy in promoting employee ownership. And as I said, it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the owners, the employees, and of course for the communities that these organizations operate in. But we can, help organizations learn more about what the tax issues may be, what some of the legal considerations. We have a pretty robust advisory board that we could direct an individual to who's interested in learning more information. So by all means, reach out to me directly, and I'll be more than happy to provide you with more information about using an ESOP strategy to promote employee ownership or to think about selling a firm to employees. And then lastly, my other comment is you don't also have to sell 100% of your firm. There are companies that use an ESOP strategy that may sell 30% of the firm to employees, and management still has a controlling interest. So there's a lot of different combinations. 30% ownership is where the trigger for many of the tax benefits that I was referring to kick in.
Okay.
Good question.
Great. And I don't believe there are any more questions. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, just please reach out to us. Our information is on our final slide. And please save the date for our next webinar, which is going to be May 7th, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on employee ownership trusts. This concludes today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, a link to the recording of this presentation will be emailed to you. And for more information on the New Jersey, New York Center for Employee Ownership, please visit our website, ownership.rutgers.edu. Thank you, Bill, for presenting, and thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.